The following episode deals with child predators, child abuse, and sexual situations. Listener discretion is advised. 3.6 million cases of child abuse are reported every year in the United States. But when you are that child and the person abusing you are the people that are supposed to be caring for you, how do you bounce back from that? How do you handle the pain? And what becomes of your life? Join me as I talk to warrior and extraordinary person, Jimmi Toro, on this episode of True Crime and Authors.
Welcome to True Crime and Authors Podcast, where we bring two passions together. The show that gives new meaning to the old adage, truth is stranger than fiction. Here's your host, David McClam.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of True Crime and Authors. Of course, I am your man, David McClam. Hey, if you guys haven't already, make sure you're joining me on all of my social medias. One link to a link tree in the show notes will get you every place you need to go. Well, this is an extraordinary people's edition, and I feel that I have an extraordinary person for you guys today. Let me introduce to you who our guest is. He is an American contemporary, internationally acclaimed artist. He's the founder of the nonprofit Rescue 11, whose mission is to protect children against predators. He's a composer and music producer. He has spoken at numerous events and mental health panels, including the 2023 NBA All-Star event. He has also created art for various charity-related projects with Rescue 11, Susan G. Komen, Breast Cancer Foundation, Boys and Girls Clubs of America, Make-A-Wish Foundation, Habitat for Humanity, and the Orange Duffel Bag Initiative. He is a warrior, and he is the author of Heal, My Journey Through the Horrors of Extreme Childhood Abuse to the Painful Yet Magical Healing Process. Please welcome author Jimmi Toro. Hey, Jimmy, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Well, you have certainly had an extraordinary life. So before we jump into all of that, is there anything else you'd like to tell us about yourself other than what we just heard?
Well, that was probably too much, right? Makes me sound all big, and I'm not that big. But that's what we do. Now, I've been fortunate to pursue my art and music as a career. A lot of artists and musicians don't get to do that as a career. It's really tough to make money, in the arts, let's say. Then you add the whole story of child abuse to the mix, and it gets a bit interesting, sure.
So your book Heal deals with your story of child abuse, which I read the synopsis. I was pretty much horrified. I am a product of child abuse myself, both much like yourself from a childhood standpoint and on the adult end. Our abuse kind of started around the similar age because I remember things going back to when I was 4, but nothing like I have read about you. In your childhood, it says that you were around sadists. Who were these people? Were these your parents, or how did you get around these folks?
Interesting. So the definition of a sadist, right, is somebody who enjoys inflicting pain on another. And these child abusers, they're the worst sadists because they enjoy inflicting pain on little children. They are the ultimate cowards because little children can't fight back, right? They enjoy doing it, and they enjoy it to an extreme, to a point that most people have a hard time believing is even possible. And once you understand how much they enjoy it, then some of it actually starts to make sense of why they do it. In the realm of abuse, you have a classic idea where maybe a bad father beats up his kid, or a worse father rapes his daughter, right? And if you keep going down that rabbit hole, you end up with these creeps, and they band together. If you imagine like the Ku Klux Klan, all dressed in their robes and doing their traditions and whatnot, the satanistic ritual abuse folks, I have a hard time calling them human. But they do get together and they have their traditions and this and that. And at the core of their traditions is to sacrifice children. And that's not anything new today. That's been going on through time, right? But to think that, okay, in my little sleepy neighborhood that I live in or wherever I live, there might be a group of these individuals secretly doing the same thing. Most people can't imagine in my town that's happening. And so I grew up in a little town outside of Fresno in California, just a little town. And my parents were involved with other parents, et cetera, and they formed this kind of religious cult type of thing. And that's exactly what they would do. And they would pick kids out of the families, and they're clever people. Like my family had 10 kids, and so me and my sister got chosen. I have no idea why, but the others did not. And you're like, well, why? One of their tactics is if they pick one kid out of a family and that one kid says, hey, bad things are happening to me, and the authorities or anybody else asks the other kids, did anything bad happen to them? And they say no, then the kid won't be believable. And that is often the case. And even often, in my case, my father was part of it, but my mother was not. And I don't know this, but I'm guessing she was threatened, which is also pretty common too. And these abusers, they do the absolute worst things, all the way up to actually killing, sacrificing children. And I've seen other little kids sacrificed. I don't know how I made it out alive, because they torture you. And the more screams and the more torture they can get out of you, the more they enjoy it, which is totally messed up. And from about age 3 to about age 8, that's what I went through hundreds and hundreds of times. And if you're abused as a kid, let's say once, and you have, let's say an uncle abused you or whatever, and you have a loving mom, let's say, you can go to, and you can tell your mom what happened, and she provides safety for you. Well, in that case, you can literally, because of the safety and the love, you can literally release that episode out of your body. You don't have to store it. But if your guardian or your parents are your abusers and you have nowhere to go for safety, because the one thing you want as a kid is you want safety when you're being abused. That's safety and protection. If you don't have that, you literally will store that in your body. You'll lock all that up. And it's not uncommon. In my case, all through my adulthood, until about 15 years ago, I had no memory of the abuse. About 15 years ago, these episodes started happening to me, these painful panic attacks. I mean, they're extremely painful. My whole body would shut down. My whole body would start shaking. My heart would race off the charts. I'd be rushed to the ER because I felt like I was going to die. I had lots of those. And then for 14 years, and then my 15th year of that mess was last year. And that's when the memories all started tumbling in, and it got worse. It got way worse. So what's interesting to understand about this is that when those memories come back, it's not just the memory. The smells, the sounds, the sights, the scared to death, the fear, all of it comes back. And not just that, all the hormones come back. So when you're in a fight and flight panic situation, your body is just rushed with adrenaline and cortisol. And well, that can save you in a moment of getting away from a dangerous situation. But when that happens to you over and over and over, it starts to have damage on your body. And so when these memories come back, all of that comes back. The hormonal rush, everything comes back, and you get to relive it all. And that's why this is so horrific, is like you lived it as a child, and when it comes back in adulthood, it often comes back unannounced. It just one day out of the blue, it hits you. Now, some people can be triggered, and a triggering thing will bring that back, no doubt. But in my case, completely random. And then I had to figure out how to deal with it. And we can talk about the whole how to heal from that. We can talk about several subjects here if you want. We can talk about the actual abuse. We can talk about the perpetrators, these creeps, and why they do it, how they hide, how they get away with it. We can talk about the healing aspect of it. We can talk about trauma in general, wherever you want to go.
Well, the one thing I want to say is everything you just said is 100% true, because
it's your lived experience, right?
Right. And I'm triggered by some certain things, right? So my dad was a big black guy, about 6'6". My mother always had this thing that she liked to date really black dudes. And that would trigger me because I remember what my dad did to me, and I was scared of people like that. And even in older life now, certain things can happen, certain smells takes place, certain things I hear or see, and I'm automatically in that trigger. So that's 100% accurate.
Oh, it is. It's possible you yourself, I don't know, and many others are still holding that trauma within you. It's possible if you're still being triggered by it. I mean, you could have little Susie on the playground when she's little. You could have kids come up to her and pull her pants down and embarrass her, and that's it, right? She can carry that trauma, which is not torture and rape and beating and whatnot. She can carry that trauma with her whole life. She can go into adulthood and be afraid to talk to groups. And so, regardless of the level of trauma, let's say, our bodies, if it's not resolved, our bodies hold on to it. They just do. It can come back in a huge bang, or it can like drip into your system for years and years and years and years. And so many people who've gone through more of the horrific trauma, they become alcoholics, drug addicts, they commit suicide. Unfortunately, so it ruins their whole adult life, and then they die. That is the suffering that these abusers heap upon other humans.
Now, the one of the horrific things that I want to discuss with you about that you said did happen to you is that you were buried in a coffin at age 4 that contained a dead body.
Yeah.
What did that do to you? And when that came back, what happened with that?
Yeah. So these creeps, they have imaginations. You see this all throughout history. Humans torture other humans, even in the medieval times and everywhere. Humans can get pretty imaginative on how they torture other humans. Well, these groups can be just as imaginative on how they torture kids. And often their goal is to torture a kid and push that kid to the limit and then relieve them. And you see that in POWs who are during war, where they're tortured right up to death, and then the torture stops, right? Well, they do that to kids. And why do they do that to kids? Because they enjoy it. And so in this particular case, there was an event that they would hold at this one person's house, kind of out in the country. It's kind of like a compound in the backyard. They would have a pole, and they would, march around that pole in their robes. They have all their rules and such, just like many religions do. And sometimes they would sacrifice people at that stake. They would literally burn them. And in this particular event, they had these coffins, several coffins buried in the ground. They were open. They were completely buried. And inside, they had these adult bodies. They had cut them from their throat down to their midsection, pulled their guts out, and pulled their ribs out. And they had those bodies in these coffins. And me and a couple other kids were thrown into those cavities of those dead bodies, and the lid shuts. And you can imagine the horror that goes through that little kid. What makes it even worse, after that little guy is exhausted from screaming and banging on that lid, and then there's silence, and they open that lid, and what does that kid see? Laughing adults. That's just messed up stuff. And it's so messed up, especially messed up when you're dealing with little kids like from age 0 to age 8. And those are the years where our brain is in a state where we soak everything in. Yeah, so they did that, and I made it out alive. I have no idea why, but I must have been a little fighter kid. But so imagine all this too. Okay, so you imagine you're like a driver on a bus, and behind you, you have a bunch of passengers, and they're all little yous. They're all little versions of yous, and each one is a little you that was traumatized at some point in that little kid's life. But you're the adult now. You're the driver, and you, if you were traumatized, let's say 100 times, there would be 100 little yous on the bus, and you have to literally go back to each one individually, sometimes collectively. If you were abused the same way multiple times, you can go to a group of little yous. But if they're different types of abuses, you have to go back in time to that little you, and you have to find it, that little you. And as you're searching for that little you, what you're really searching for is the emotion attached to the abuse. Scared to death, panic, frozen, adult shaking you and yelling in your face, screaming. It could be sounds that are traumatizing. And there are other types of trauma that go beyond, let's say, the hardcore bloody beating stuff. You could be traumatized by not being heard. You can be a little kid wanting to tell people around you, hey, this is happening to me. Nobody's listening to you. You can be traumatized by carrying the weight of all those memories and not being able to release them. That could be a type of trauma. You can be traumatized by being frozen in a situation. And that's not uncommon when little kids get human trafficked and they get taken. Sometimes they can be in public with their adult slave master, if you will, and the kid won't scream or say anything. And they could be in a 7-Eleven somewhere, and the kid is just absolutely frozen, and they won't say anything. And adults just don't understand. Well, hey, you just been taken, little kid. Why don't you say to the adults around you, "Hey, I've been taken"? And they don't, because they're in that absolute state of freeze. There's fight, there's flight, there's freeze. There's one called fawn, where you will freeze and play dead until the danger passes, and you'll get back up. And so there are these different types of traumas that your body gets put into. It's a large variety.
So wouldn't you say that also fear would go into that if that child was to say something and was not believed, that the child would be afraid that what was going to happen to them afterwards?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so when these adults threaten these kids, your audience, you always have to remember that these adults are very, very good at what they do. Think about it. They wake up every day and they look at their agenda and they say, how can we ruin somebody's child? How can we steal them? How can we abuse them? This type of abuse that they do, this horrific abuse, they are sexually aroused when they do it, which is just off the charts, doesn't make sense. There's a book called POW about the prisoners of war, American prisoners of war in Vietnam. And there was one situation where a torturer would reach into the eye of a GI and put his finger in his eye and rotate it around his eyeball as a form of torture, right? And as this prisoner was being tortured in such manner, he noticed that the torturer was sexually aroused. That's just messed up stuff. That is so messed up. So these creeps at that level, that is their agenda. They are no different than a serial killer. In fact, they are serial killers, because if they kill that child, they don't care. And then you have organizations of these creeps. Like if you have a brothel and you have your clientele, and somebody comes into your brothel, they pay you money, and you get to go into a room and have sex with some girl, right? Well, they have their versions of this, but with kids. Remember the whole Pizzagate thing not too long ago that came public? Most people get caught up in Pizzagate in the sensationalism of the, what politician or what Hollywood person was involved in this and that. And that's usually the talk. But the thing to learn about Pizzagate isn't so much that. The thing to learn is that these creeps, they know what they want. They say, okay, I want to abuse a 4-year-old Asian boy, right? Or a 3-year-old white girl. They have their what they like. And so if they're going to be part of that organization and they're going to say, hey, tomorrow I'm coming in and I'm going to pay you a bunch of money and you put me in this private room and I want there to be a 4-year-old Asian boy. Well, they're not going to say over the phone, I want a 4-year-old Asian boy, because if they get busted, now there's evidence against them. They're going to say, hey, I want to order a ham and pineapple with olives pizza. And that's code for that item on the menu. These are the kind of people we're dealing with, and they live right in our communities. I'm in Salt Lake City, and just in the last year, an ex-attorney general has been busted for child abuse. A sex therapist, 12 counts of rape for young girls. A gym, just a couple of weeks ago, a guy started a gym around gymnastics, had little kids come in and learn gymnastics. And he got busted. He had these cameras hidden in the boys and girls' rooms. A coach at a high school got busted. A mayor of a city here got busted. These people are right in our communities, and they are doing what they do. And I'm trying to make people aware of it.
The one thing that your story reminded me of, and I wanted to bring this up to the audience so that they can actually see, because I've said this before, I said these things have been going on for years, but because you don't really see them or hear a lot about them, we think they don't. In 1989, there was a case of a young man named Jacob Wetterling that took place in Minnesota. I lived in Minnesota at that time.
Yeah.
He was kidnapped. Him and his brother and a friend, I think it was biking back. But when they stopped to kidnap them, they picked him out specifically and let the other two go. It was due to his age, his sex. Right around that same time in these areas, though, between Wisconsin and Minnesota, there was various kids being taken. One was a child who was a girl who was age 10, which her and Jacob ends up at the same spot because it was a satanic ritual by sadistic people. They had to have the right mix of kid,
Yes.
whether it's gender, age, height, hair, because their ritual and their sacrifice determined that. If they messed that up, they messed up the whole ritual. I was studying occults back at that time, and as soon as he was taken, I said, he was kidnapped by somebody who's sadistic and into Satanism. Sure enough, that's what came out. When I was listening and reading your story, I'm like, this sounds exactly like Jacob Whittingly. Have you ever heard of that case?
Yes, and you're exactly right. They know what they want. And these creeps have preferences, right? I mean, if you're just a guy and you like tall girls, you don't like short girls, well, that's just a preference you have. But if you're one of those creeps and you like 4-year-old boys and you don't like 6-year-old boys, well, that's what you're going to go after.
And the shocking thing is they were not afraid of being caught because they let the other two go. Just left them on the side of the road, left Jacob's bike, and took off.
Well, in that situation, right? They're pretty smart. Yeah, maybe they're not afraid. I don't know if I agree with that. I think they would be afraid of getting caught, but I think they would be smarter than that. Maybe in that case they were just idiots. You could be right. But also maybe there's more to that story on how clever they were. Maybe they scoped that little kid out for days and weeks. Maybe they knew exactly who his friends were. Maybe they knew who his friends' parents were. Maybe those friends came from broken homes where, they're not going to follow up on it. Who knows? Often they're very clever that way.
Now, this is just the tip of the iceberg of your story. I want to transition now into some other facets, but I want to let the audience know there will be links where you can get your book Heal. You deal with this story as well as 22 other stories in the book of horrific trauma. I don't think anything can be more horrific than this. We're going to make sure that everybody knows how to get a hold of Heal because I want to transition into now that you've made it out of this, you've started an organization where you're trying to bring down predators. I look at there's a lot of channels on YouTube that deals with people that are pretty much exposing predators. Their whole thing is to sting people that's trying to meet up with little kids and things of that nature. I think that's a needed service. And YouTube shuts them down and calls them bullying, but you're saving children and letting people know this is what's going on.
Yeah.
What do you think, since you've lived this, I know you have insight of this, what makes a person sadistic to the point to where they want to do the things they've done to you and to other children like this?
Yeah, if only that question had a simple answer, right? You might say, well, what makes a serial killer become a serial killer, right? These sadists who do this and kill kids in their rituals, they are no different than a serial killer. And I don't know the answer to that. Most of those troubled folks, often they come from a very troubled beginning. Broken homes, they were abused themselves, etc. But still, I was abused horribly. I didn't turn out that way. I don't know that psychologists and smart people have an answer to that. But what I do know is they exist, and they exist in abundance. And I do know they are powerful. I do know that they are probably at some level in every community around the world, at some level. Now, I don't know that for sure. But if I just I live in a little suburb out of Salt Lake, Utah. In a 1 mile radius of my house, which is just in a neighborhood, there are 10 registered sex offenders. Well, those are the ones that are registered. There are many more, I know, I can't prove it, but there are many more that haven't been caught yet who are not registered. They're everywhere. You can pretty much look in any neighborhood in the U.S., possibly the world, if you could find the data, and there's probably sex offenders in your registered sex offender. And these sex offenders at this level, I don't know the number either, but I wouldn't be surprised if the answer is 0. They don't reform. Unfortunately, it's just the way it is. They don't reform by and large. Now, maybe there's 1 or 2 that's reformed and this and that, but even the ones that say they're reformed, it's very suspect. These creeps, they will join orphanages so they get closer to kids. There's a friend of mine in Texas who's about our age, and when he was young, there was a pedophile group who went around to single mothers, and they were part of the Boy Scouts of America. And they went around to single mothers who had young kids and basically said to the mothers, oh, we'll take care of your boy. We'll be your father figure. And what young mother wouldn't say, oh, great, a wholesome group like the Boy Scouts of America? And he was caught up into that and abused horribly. They are clever, clever people. and they gravitate towards anything that involves kids. Orphanages, religions, youth groups, schools where kids are, they are all over, unfortunately. I don't know how to answer your question, what turns a person into that. I don't know.
And the saddest part about that is, and I want to point this out too, is that they could be anywhere. They could be your clergy, they could be your children's teacher.
They are.
And I do know for a fact, people like, you need to do more screening. I work with a couple people, Donna Humphrey, Alecia Lockhart. They're trying to bring down the death fetish community, very bad community. They go after women because they have fantasies of doing things of the sexual nature with dead female bodies. And we point out that all the screening in the world sometimes, because of how clever these people is, will never tell you who they are. If they've stayed off the radar this time, they've always been outstanding people, they've never been to jail, that person looking at your child could very well be one of these people.
Absolutely. And at some point, you probably in your life will cross paths with one of these creeps and not know it.
Now, earlier you said that if you're still triggered by some of these past events, most likely you are still holding on to those. How do you start to heal from trauma like this, or just basically any form of trauma to get rid of it?
That is a great question. Unfortunately, it is a really tough question also, because there are many different opinions from the experts out there, the psychologists, the therapists, the counselors, etc. There are all kinds of different modalities. Some espouse, body work, tapping, EMDR, which is as you're going back in a memory, they hold their finger in front of your eye and go back and forth. And the basic idea there on that one is that if you're going back in time into something awful, you want to keep yourself grounded in the present while you're doing it, right? And so the eye movement, that was discovered by a psychologist, would walk their patients through the hallways as they were going back to awful abuse, and just the movement of walking kept them grounded. There's breath work, breathing techniques to try to help you heal. There's even one around drama, and it's like, okay, we're gonna reenact what happened to you, like on a stage in front of a group of people, which I think is kind of silly. But anyway, so there's a lot of confusion around there on what to do. In my case, what worked for me, and I think will work for most people, is, and I had a really good psychologist who specialized in sexual ritualistic abuse. In some communities, it's called SRA. As an acronym. When these episodes hit me and this pain hit me, what was happening is all this adrenaline was flooding into my system, and I was reliving this. And during those moments, I would go back and first thing I would do is I would try to name the emotion of what I was feeling. Was I feeling scared? Was I feeling threatened? What was it? What exactly was my feeling? So there's this idea called name it to tame it. And so the idea is to name the emotion. Then I would literally go back in time, almost like in a trance. I would literally go back to that memory, and I would go find that little boy, wherever that little boy was. And sometimes I found that little boy quickly, and other times it was a lot of work trying to find that little kid. When I'd find that little kid, I would find that little kid right in the middle of the terror, right in the middle of the abuse is where I'd find that little kid. And my job as an adult wasn't to go rescue that kid out of that situation. My job was to help that kid recognize that that kid could have power to bring his situation to safety. He could use any magic he wanted. And it's this idea of literally going back in time and rewriting the past, literally changing the past events. One, for instance, was I was being grabbed. There was a room and awful torture was happening, and over here was a room where other kids were. And this lady came to grab me, and she was yelling in my face because I didn't want to go, because I knew what was happening there. It's fascinating because she approached me with this sweet smile on her face, like, oh, this sweetness, do what I want you to do. And as soon as I said no, I didn't want to go, her sweet smile changed to the most evil face you would imagine. And that anger just like sparked in her. And she grabs me, and I found that little boy right in the middle of being grabbed and pulled into that room. And I was able to go find that little kid and whisper in that little kid's ears, what do you want to do to get out of this? And every time I either witnessed or helped a little me get out of a situation, what came out of that was a complete surprise to me. It wasn't adult me making the decision. It was little me. And in that particular case, he said, I want to freeze her. And as she was in full scream, hands ready to grab this little kid, she froze in a block of ice. It's magical. I mean, it almost sounds like this isn't true and it doesn't work, but it works. And when she froze, me and that little kid, we were able to get out of that situation and sneak out the side door and just walk. And we walked for, I don't know how many hours. That experience of rewriting the narrative, changing the past, bringing safety to that little kid, when that was accomplished, all of the hurt that I was feeling completely went away. Boom, like that. And it's never come back. And my belief, and I know it worked for me, and I've heard it work for others, is that particular traumatic episode that has been stored in me for decades, it's released. It's no longer in me. It's fantastic. It's magical. It's like almost too good to be true. But to go to it is so painful. And I think a lot of people don't release their trauma for a couple reasons. It's so painful to go there, and they like holding on to something that's familiar. As odd as that sounds, it's like the classic idea of a young girl who was raped repeatedly, and then she grows up into adulthood, and she's attracted to and dates guys who abuse her. You see that all the time. You're like, why? Why would you date this guy who's abusing you? Because something, oddly enough, with that guy abusing her is familiar to her. As crazy as that sounds, it happens all the time.
So the other thing you like to talk about is transforming the hard aspects of life into personal power. How would one go about doing that who's faced a life of trauma?
Think about this idea. There's a classic type of story that's been told through centuries of time. And it's the classic story of a knight behind the castle walls who needs to go out of the castle walls and go rescue the princess that the dragon took, right? As soon as that knight goes outside the castle walls, that knight is now in an area of danger. He's left his safety. He's not behind the castle walls where it's safe and he's protected by family, friends, and the military, whatever. And he has to go out and find this princess and rescue this princess. Well, in that journey, that knight faces a lot of danger, possibly death. And then he finally finds the dragon and the princess. Now he has to contend with the dragon. The dragon is good at killing people like him. And maybe off to the side are the bones of a bunch of dead knights who tried to rescue the dragon as well. Well, if he succeeds, kills the dragon, rescues the princess, and makes it back to the safety of the castle walls, he has gone on a heroic journey. If he doesn't succeed, well, then he doesn't succeed. If he gets halfway out, fear takes over and he comes back. That's not a heroic journey. Well, these traumas that we all face at some level, in my opinion, we need to face them head on, and they're hard and they're difficult, and we can resolve them, and that can be our heroic journey in life. And it's very personal, and it happened to us. And then if we go from a victim to a survivor, and then go from a survivor to a warrior, let's say, do something about it, I can't think of a better heroic journey in life.
And I think for myself, that's how I release my trauma. I have been doing guest spots this year because, as you know, a lot of men that's been through any type of abuse, whether it's during childhood or during adulthood, don't like to talk about it. And a lot of that is because of how we are born and bred as men and what we're told we can and should not do emotion-wise. And I feel like it's important because there is a lot of us, as you know, that has gone through something like this or even worse. And we don't talk about it. And when you don't talk about it, you don't release it. And when you don't release it, it turns and manifests into other problems, health-wise and things of that nature. And so that's how I also take my power back, is by saying I'm not giving my abuser what he wanted, which was to silence me and not put this out there. And hopefully I get other men to come forward and say, well, if I can hear him do it, if I can listen to an episode of Jimmi Toro do it, he wrote a book about it, then I can take my stance and take my own power back.
Yeah, and if you have a little guidance, you know, some steps, and you're willing to go back into that trauma that was so awful, if you're willing to go, that's your dragon. If you're willing to go there and fight it, the end result is, oh my gosh, it's magical to have that all released out of your system. It's incredible. The opposite of it is awful, to carry that around all these years. I was talking to a guy who's part of a men's group kind of like an AA group where they get together and talk about their alcohol challenges. He's part of a group where they talk about this kind of abuse. And they are of the mindset that this is something they have to live with their whole life. And I'm like, no, that's an awful mindset. Stop focusing on that. And it's sad because so many do fall into that camp and they become, my friend, he was an alcoholic for 10, 20 years. And can you imagine trying to struggle with your trauma and then on top of that, struggle with alcoholism or an abusive relationship or any other addiction? That's tough.
Now, part of your work now is you're trying to eradicate and make people aware of child predators like this. Can you tell us a little bit about Rescue 11 and the mission and the job you're doing with that?
Absolutely. So our strategy is to go into high schools, set up a club at a high school, the younger generations that are being most abused. The mission of that high school club, that little club, is to reach out into the community and make relationships with the police, with attorneys, with the judicial system, with churches, with nonprofits, with any group that cares about their community, and to make them aware that these predators are within our community and what to look for, how they get to our kids online, for instance, and educate the kids in their high school and possibly even younger schools on how these predators, how they operate, how they do what they do, and honestly, just make the whole community aware that this danger is right in their community and what to look for.
What have you seen come out of Rescue 11 so far as you've been doing this? What stories have you gotten from that?
Unfortunately, I'm just starting this. So we've got a couple schools just starting to get online. The one school that we started with is in Southern Oregon, which, by the way, had no idea until recently that Oregon, believe it or not, don't know why, has the largest concentration of registered sex offenders per capita of any state in the U.S.
Wow.
I know, by a lot. Like an average state might have 200 per 100,000 people. They have like 700 per 100,000 people. Off the charts. And so we've started a club in a little town in Southern Oregon called Grants Pass. And it's just getting started, but we've already reached out to a lot of the community. And they're all excited about this. Once that model gets going, we'll repeat that model. If any of your listeners live in a community where they're interested in us coming in and setting up that model at a high school, I would love for them to reach out. It's rescue11 or rescue11.org.
We'll leave that link in the show notes too as well, because I do have that link to your website as well for that.
Awesome.
What do you want everybody to take away from reading Heal as well as your story?
I want people to be aware of what trauma can do to an individual and what it does to your body, the physiological aspect of it, how it stores in your body, how it can drip out. You could call it stress, on a light level, and then how to heal from it. And my situation, let's say, is extreme, but it's the same thing. If you feel you're holding on to any trauma and you feel it there and you just can't figure out how to release it, there's a way to release it. That's what I want people to get out of it.
In closing, is there anything you'd like to say to your readers and fans and to the listeners out there that may be listening today?
If this subject interests you at all, please get a hold of me. Please reach out to me. Please reach out to the nonprofit. If you have time or can donate money or whatever. This scourge, I don't want to sound religious or whatever, but this scourge of child predators, I believe, is worse. The pedophile movement in the world is trying to become mainstream. They're changing their name to MAPS, MAPS. Minor attracted persons. They're trying to soften it and making it more acceptable in communities for an adult to be sexually attracted to a minor. Even in the UN, there's recently news that body is trying to soften some of the laws against pedophiles. This scourge, this ugliness, we have to be aware of it. We got to know our enemy. We can't just pretend it's not there. We can't just put our blinders on and pretend, oh, I live in this nice little neighborhood, nothing bad's happening, because it is.
That is definitely for sure. Jimmy, I thank you for coming on the show. I am more enlightened by what I've heard today. I am in the process of finishing up your book, and I'm going to read every bit of that. I also promote his book, guys. I'm going to tell you where to get that in just a second. But thank you for coming on. Anytime that you want to come back, you know how to get a hold of me. I'll be more than enlightened to have you come back on the show.
Oh, I'd love to come back. We could delve into any one of these directions on another episode. I'd love to.
Yes, because there's definitely a lot more to dive into.
There's a lot to unpack. I would love to chat with you a little more about your story and kind of go there with you and dig into that a little. That would be fun.
For sure, for sure. We'd definitely be doing that. So thank you for coming on. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
All right, guys, that was Jimmi Toro. You can pick up a copy of his book, Healed: My Journey Through the Horrors of Extreme Childhood Abuse to the Painful Yet Magical Healing Process at Amazon. Make sure you're picking that up. The link to that will be in the show description, as well as to Jimmi Toro's own personal website, where you can keep tabs on what he's doing with Rescue 11, as well as everything else that he's doing over there. And you can see some of his fabulous artwork that is in the book and outside of that. All right, so I thank you guys for tuning in. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode and took something from it. I hope you are being safe and good to yourself and each other. And remember, always stay humble. An act of kindness can make someone's day. A little love and compassion goes a long way. And this is the podcast where two passions becomes one. I'll catch you guys on the next one.
Thank you for listening to True Crime and Authors. Don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe. Join us on social media. On Facebook at True Crime and Authors. On Twitter at Authors True. On YouTube and TikTok at True Crime and Authors. And email at truecrimeandauthors@gmail.com. Cover art and logo designed by Dazzling_Ray from Fiverr. Sound mixing and editing by David McClam. Intro script by Sophie Wild from Fiverr. And I'm the voice guy, your imaging guy from Fiverr. See you next time on True Crime and Authors.